second seminar series of the, I've got to agree to this. Got it. Okay. Welcome to the second seminar in our 22 seminar series. Great to be here. Great to have everyone participating. Just very briefly, wanted to remind everyone that we're supported by EAST, Maastricht University, and the Center for Responsible Innovation at Arizona State University. And that the reason we're doing this is to provide an opportunity for those who are already in or interested in the STIR method and the community worldwide so that we can learn, connect, and grow with each other. We've got a number of co-organizers for the seminar series, and I won't go through them all, but I wanted to give you their names and show you how diverse the array is of people who are helping to get the word out. And finally, just to remind people of the three main objectives for STIR. So STIR is a qualitative research methodology, but it's also quasi-experimental because it combines interviews, observations, participant observation with this unique dialogue and interaction and decision mapping, and also uses pre and post surveys and some little bit of quantitative analysis. And it's quasi-experimental because we look at change over time and what the effect of our intervention is. Our intervention, of course, is the STIR methodology. And we do this for three reasons. One is to understand expert technical capacities, the nature and limits of those capacities, to take into account more societal and ethical considerations while they're doing their technical work. Number two, to explore the scope of expanding these capacities. And of course, we're not the ones expanding them as STIR researchers. The participants themselves are the ones that may or may not choose or be able to expand their capacities. But we want to assess this kind of room for expansion. And finally, by doing number one and number two, we can think of our work as building those capacities. But it's important that we only want to build capacities insofar as we're not departing from the first two objectives. In other words, if we set out to build capacities, we might end up making suggestions or advocating for certain routes. And then this kind of gets us out of STIR methodology into something we call STIR 2.0. It's fine to do that. We just want to be transparent if we sort of move away from STIR, from the STIR methodology. And again, by way of reminder, there are three main components. I already mentioned there are 7 or 8 components, but the three main ones that are really distinct to STIR are the decision protocol, the ethos of engagement, sometimes known as the embedded humanist. This is how we use the protocol and how we don't use it. And then finally, the framework for midstream modulation by which we analyze the results. And STIR has been practiced since 2006 and then collectively since 2009. And to date, there have been 80 studies around the globe in over 20 countries and on 4 continents. And I'm very pleased to report that just this week, I found out about the 80th known STIR study. And so this is the PhD dissertation of Hannah Stams in the Netherlands. And one of her chapters is a STIR study looking at chemistry education teachers and what they take into account as they're teaching, preparing for teaching, thinking about teaching. And so she looks at the multivalent set of different matters of attention in the practitioner and also the dynamics by which the attention changes. So it's a very interesting study. It's got some nice stuff and it can apply, I think, to all the different research, development, innovation, private, public types of research and technology development that we look at. Of course, we have 12 different speakers for this particular seminar series. They've all published or have prepared papers that we distribute in advance. And this month, we are pleased to be joined by Dr. Daan Schuurbiers, who is the director of a Dutch consultancy for responsible innovation that is not exactly the way I'm going to pronounce it, but it's close to De Proeffabriek. Yeah, I've probably got about 3 or 4 syllables off, but I'm close enough. But anyway, Daan has been one of the earliest practitioners and developers of the STIR method, starting in, I think, 2008 when we met on a train in the Netherlands. And And then Daan came over to ASU and we worked together. And he has then taken what he learned in STIR and in his dissertation research more generally into the private sector and also in public-private partnerships. And so we may have time at the end of his presentation to hear a little bit about what he's been doing post-STIR. But for now, I'm going to invite Daan to take over, and very much looking forward to your presentation, Daan.
Thank you, Eric. I will just share my screen here. All right, can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so thanks, Eric. It's a real pleasure to present at this STIR seminar, and it's great to see a couple of familiar faces, but also some new people in the room. I hope to get to know you a little bit better throughout this seminar. The invitation to give this talk actually made me think back of the whole STIR experience. It's been 15 years now since I did the lab studies, and a lot has happened since then. We've seen a wide range of STIR studies being carried out across the globe over the years. First, of course, as part of the NSF-funded STIR project, and then through various others, US and European projects, including STIR cities and others, several European projects. I incidentally saw the announcement for this seminar on LinkedIn. I got a message, would you be interested? I thought, well, that's me. That was fun. That was through the Tetris project. So I am assuming that there may be a link there too. The Journal of Responsible Innovation was launched in 2014. We witnessed the rise and fall of RRI in Europe. And I hope I'm not offending anyone with this, but at least in Europe, interest in RRI is waning. We'll come back to that, I think. And in its place, we saw the rise of safe and sustainable by design. And I'll also come back to that a little bit later. And on a personal level, also a lot of things have happened. I finished my PhD, raised a family, started a consultancy, the Proeffabriek. Eric almost pronounced it right, so that's good. And in the last decade, I've been involved in a wide array of activities, working with research in and beyond the lab, but also operating in the wider world of research and innovation policy and practice. And I think how I look back at STIR and that whole experience and interdisciplinary engagement is, of course, shaped by all those experiences in the last 15 years. So how to make sense of all that in the 90 minutes that we have in this seminar? Well, I thought to, let me see if, yeah, here we go. I thought to kind of structure the presentation a little bit and also to share some of my experiences, but also to learn from your experience. I would want to split this seminar into 3 parts. So first, I'd like to tell you about the experiment, you know, the STIR studies that we did in Delft and Tempe in 2008 and 2009. And to prevent this from becoming a long monologue, I would love to hear any questions that you might have on this. It's very, I mean, there's so many ways in which you could present a study like that. You may have specific interests, either in the method or in the ways of approaching the research participants, or in, you know, making sense of the results. Or so, you know, feel free to, if you have any concrete questions, to let them know, either put them in the chat or let me know, or Cynthia or Eric. So we can also have a discussion about this. If not, it becomes a very long talk, I think. So then, after that, I would like to discuss with you the current state of STIR, and maybe Marijke and Eric can help a little bit here. But I've been out for quite a while, so I would love to hear actually what you were all up to at this point. Perhaps those of you who are planning a STIR study, or there are those that have just finished the study and would like to discuss it. Or you may be interested in doing one, but you may be hesitant for some reason. So I think if we can, we preserve some time for that to have that discussion. And then, as Eric said, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Proeffabriek. Because what I hope to convince you is that what I've been doing in this consultancy for the last 10 years is a very natural extension of the overall mission that also drew me into STIR 15 years ago. I'll tell you a little bit later what that mission is. But I also hope to inspire you to contribute your expertise to create a more socially responsive research and innovation system. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that later. But before we get to all that, I thought it might be nice to start off with a very quick Mentimeter poll. I'm not sure how familiar you are in the US with Mentimeter, but in Europe, it's quite well established. So let me, I think I can actually keep sharing this, right? Let's see if I can, no, I'll stop sharing this for the moment and get back to that later. See if I can share my Mentimeter. Here it is. Can you see that? Yep. Yes. All right. So if you're not familiar with Mentimeter, the ID is, I'll put that in presentation mode. Oh. The ID is that you go to menti.com and you fill out the code that is on the top of your screen. And I can also, if I push a button, let's see, I think it's this one. No. Where is it? Oh, let me have a look. Oh, I can't find it. Anyway, I see that some people are finding their way into the room already. So that's good. I don't know where it is. I have 3 people in the room now. Is anybody having difficulties getting in? I see there's 4 people. So if you're in, just press the heart and you're in. All right, as people are trying to find their way in, and let us know in the chat if you can't find your way in. Let's just see. What is your involvement in STIR? I would like to know. Oh, there's some responses coming here. So some of you have done a STIR study in the past. Some of you plan to do a STIR study in the future. And some of you have a general interest in the topic. So just to kind of get a sense of your involvement, who is planning to do a STIR study in the future? Could you please just let us know?
Don, I'm just going to say that I fall into 2 categories. I've done STIR studies in the past, and I plan to keep doing them. So I'm a little bit of an anomaly, maybe.
Oh, okay, that's good. That's good. Well, maybe not. Maybe there's more of you. But the person who is planning to do a STIR study, please feel free to. But I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself, actually. Cynthia, do you know this?
I can unmute myself.
Yeah.
Okay.
We hear you.
Lyric?
Yes. So my STIR study, I'm still learning the protocol, and I'm doing an independent study where I am conducting STIR exercises with my coworkers at a university in Arizona. And so, you know, it's really challenging because I work in an IT department, and a lot of the people I work with are very overloaded. So I'm thinking I want to study workplace stress and how engaging in STIR affects that.
Interesting. And you're saying a university in Arizona? Is it Arizona State University, or are you at a different one?
I'm at a different one. So the one I work at is Northern Arizona University up in Flagstaff.
Yep. Yeah. Nice. So welcome. So we may come back to you, Lyric, at some point to get a sense of what STIR is up to now in part 2 of the meeting. Thank you. And
Sounds good.
Antonia, sorry. And Antonio, I see you also unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I'm also interested in doing a kind of STIR study, but I will talk about this later because we're doing a kind of variation of STIR, but I'm very interested in STIR in general and in doing a STIR study, yes. Nice. I'm just not so experienced as the rest of you, so I'm still not so confident.
Okay. Oh, well, we should definitely talk about it then, but let's reserve that for part 2, maybe, Antonia. Is that okay? Yeah. All right. So 2 people plan to do a STIR study. That's good. And just to get a sense of me of you know, when presenting, could you just let us know what your background is? And I know, you know, most of you are probably somewhere in the middle, but I've deliberately made it a binary choice. You're either a social scientist or you're a natural scientist, just to get a sense of what you associate with most. Oh, that's actually quite an equal division. Nice, good, great. Yeah, all right. And then I think I have one more, and then I'll move back to the presentation. Right, this comes back to the point that we were making last month with Steven's presentation. Is your interest in STIR mostly academic? Again, I'm trying to make this as binary as I can, so I said purely academic, but are you above all curious to observe on how interdisciplinary interactions in the lab work? Or are you what you might call interventionist in the sense that you want to change how science and innovation are done?
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump in, if it's okay, Daan, to make a comment about myself. So I'm interventionist insofar as, you know, I'm interested in STIR because I want to improve the governance of science and society. However, I'm also very rigorous in terms of insisting that you sort of stay within this very constrained mode of doing STIR. So even though I'm responsible for anybody who's, you know, sort of holding back their interventionist spirit, it's not because I don't care about changing the world, right? It's just because I think the best way to do that is in this more controlled manner.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I think we'll also come back to that actually, either in part 1, 2, or 3, or in all of them. Actually, I think it's a key topic that we're discussing. All right, I think that's it for the moment. Anybody else want to comment on this slide? If not, I'll go back to the presentation. Comments, please feel free. No? All right. Well, as I said, I think we're going to come back to this. I'll stop sharing this and I'll try to share my PowerPoint again. All right. Let's see if that's okay. It's a little bit awkward. Yeah, here we go. Let's talk. So this is part 1, actually. This is STIR into microbiotechnology labs. And I thought it'd be interesting to give you a little bit of background to this study because it didn't come from nowhere. So I had just started a PhD project at Delft University Technology in 2005, and that was called Empowering Scientists in Their Social Responsibility. And I was located in this newly established group in the Department of Biotechnology in Delft, and it was called the Working Group on Biotechnology in Society. And the idea was that we, as a group of social scientists and philosophers, would work with the biotechnologists in the department to empower them in their social responsibility, whatever that meant. And this topic was very close to my heart because I had become convinced during my studies, part chemistry and part philosophy, that the natural sciences and the humanities have a lot to learn from each other. And this interest in the integration of the natural and the social sciences only grew more during an earlier stint as a consultant for the task group on public perceptions of the European Federation of Biotechnology in 2002 until 2005. And at that time, there was, of course, an intense public controversy over biotechnology, especially GM crops, cloning. And by observing the concerns that social groups had and the wholly unsatisfactory response to those concerns by biotechnology enactors, so enactors, the researchers, the producers, and the policymakers enabling biotechnology research, I realized that somehow the concerns of societal stakeholders needed to be heard much more clearly, both in biotechnology policy and in research. So this PhD research was for me a unique opportunity to explore in close collaboration with the biotechnologists how broader societal concerns could be incorporated in the earliest phases of research in the research laboratory. And all I needed now was a credible approach to explore how to do such collaborative engagement. But then I quickly found actually there wasn't a lot to go on at the time. There were philosophical analyses of science and technology, like ones by Arie Rip, who you may know, and the Dutch philosopher Henk Verhoog. And there were ethnographic studies, think of Bruno Latour, and there was action research. But there was actually very little in the way of concrete approaches to engage in philosophical exploration with researchers in the research laboratory. So being able to identify a scientifically, rigorous, accepted approach to tackle my main research question, I was at a bit of a loss. And even more so because for the researchers that I was supposed to work with in the lab, the idea of social responsibility was not to change anything that they were doing in the lab, but instead it was to explain better to concerned citizens how wonderful biotechnology was, how it was going to save the world. And if people were critical of biotechnology, it was because they didn't understand yet all the benefits that it would bring. And with hindsight, I shouldn't have been too surprised at that stance, but there you go. So I was at a bit of a loss, but then fortunately, through my literature review of social responsibility in science, I got in touch with Arie Rip, who was then at Twente University, because Arie had written a thesis on social responsibility in chemistry in 1981. And as we talked, Arie suggested that there was this guy named Eric Fischer, and he happened to be in the Netherlands, and he might have just the thing that I was looking for. So I read Eric's paper from 2006, which you may or may not know. And this is actually what Eric and Roop Mahajan wrote in 2006. I'm just going to read out on the screen here. No clear implementation methods exist for US legislation on integrating societal considerations into nanotechnology research and development. Well, exactly my problem, An empirical study was thus undertaken to investigate the possibility and utility of socio-technical integration during nanoscale engineering research in an academic setting. Okay. For 12 weeks, an embedded humanist interacted with 3 graduate engineering researchers to identify and assess opportunities for influencing research decisions in accordance with societal concerns. So, I knew at that point that I had to find out more. And Eric did happen to be in the Netherlands, actually, at the time. So we met in The Hague just a couple of days later, and we hit it off straight away. So Eric was looking to follow up on his initial study in Boulder, Colorado, that this paper was about, and I was looking for my rigorous approach to tackle my PhD research questions. So that was good. So in the end, we came up with the following research questions to guide the study. So the first is, to what extent can midstream modulation be used as a framework to render the broader socio-ethical dimensions of research visible in the laboratory? And second, do research participants consider critical reflection on this broader context to be relevant? So these questions should be understood in the context of the PhD research. Could the framework help to merge the 2 types of expertise in any meaningful way? And so this is what we did in the end. We did one study at the Department of Biotechnology where I was located. That was in June to November 2008. And the second one, a little bit later, at Wim Vermaas's lab at the Center for Bioenergy and Photosynthesis at Arizona State University. And they're working on cyanobacteria. And the people in Department of Biotechnology are working on yeast. So it's industrial biotech, let's put it that way. So then we try to be as scientifically rigorous as any qualitative research would allow. So this table kind of suggests that we had 4 research participants that we would have, or I would have, high interaction with. And high interaction in this case means we do the pre and post interviews. We meet several times a week in the lab for a period of 12 weeks. And we apply the STIR protocol to our conversations. And then we gauge, the outcomes of those, that data, so to say. And we had 4 controls. So we just did the pre and post interviews. So we could look for comparable traits to the researchers in the different labs. So that's also why you see it's rather structured here, having the same, let's say, what's the word, distinction between basic research and applied research in the 2 universities. Same type of study. Anyway, in retrospect, I think maybe that was a little bit too much, but at least we did our best to make it as rigorous as possible. So anyway, so that's me in the lab.
Just say, Daan, since you wanted people to interrupt you, I'll just say that it may have been a little bit too rigorous for your small study because it was just too, but Marijke and I have talked about this, of going back and getting all known STIR studies, of which we have 80, and then trying to fill this out a little bit. So I think it's a nice foundation that others can build upon.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, you have to do that the best way you can anyway, right? I mean, we talked about this last month with Steven as well. How do you know that, how can you control, that what you're observing is actually an effect of your intervention? I mean, it's incredibly difficult with qualitative research, but you cannot ignore that, yeah.
And I hate to say it, but it's true for quantitative research too. Causality versus correlation.
Absolutely. Yeah, so then I kind of immersed myself in the lab, and you can see me here in the various labs. And yeah, those of you who've done this, probably familiar site. Those of you who haven't done it but are interested, I can tell you that it's a wild ride to really try to make sense of what's going on in a lab. It's very interesting to kind of really immerse yourself and see what happens. By the way, note here that I'm wearing a lab coat in some labs and not in others, and I'll come back to that in a little while. Anyway, so we applied the protocol. We tried to map the opportunities, the considerations, the alternative, and the outcomes for every kind of tour that we did, sitting together and see, how should this be understood. That would lead to this sort of drawings. Probably difficult to make sense of this, but it made sense to us at the time. And I think more importantly, it builds a shared sense of what you're trying to understand and trying to map out. So in that sense, it's very useful. I then would take, over time, as the weeks evolved, I would take those graphs and try to map them on a graph like this, where the opportunities and outcomes are kind of mapped in time, and also where the various considerations that come into play are being linked to the research decisions. So I would propose kind of an understanding. And then the scribbles on it is how the research participant would say, well, no, you did, completely misunderstood that. And so that got kind of refined into something that we both felt was actually, what we discussed. And that looked a little bit like this, with the research progressing over time, and the considerations that pop up at the different moments in time. That's kind of the end result. So this times 4 was actually the end result of the study. So then, what does all that mean? What did it all lead to in the end? And I'm going to do it by the research questions that I posed a couple of slides back. So can the framework be used to render the broader socio-ethical dimensions of research visible in the laboratory? Well, it certainly can. Drafted, I mean, it's difficult to distill what happened, in 4 times 12 weeks of interaction, of course. But one of the things that I did is to just try to go back through my notes and see when did ethically relevant topics emerge during the discussions. And it turned out that just by feeding back, so again, this is the point that Eric also tried to make a little bit earlier, I think, I wouldn't say, is this right what you're doing? Should you be, I just tried to observe what they were doing and ask them, what they thought of that. And that would naturally, bring out all these ethical issues. I think it's a colleague of Eric in Arizona State University, Joe Herkert, who had this distinction between microethics and macroethics that spoke to me at that time. And you saw all these microethical and macroethical issues emerge, of itself, so to say. So what I found is that through this, what we call extended ethnography, the ethically relevant aspects of research became explicit, they became visible. Now, note that the point is not that such topics emerged. It's not like they weren't there, and because of the interactions, they were there. I think the point is that they were, of course, they were always there. Researchers handle, more or make moral decisions, normative considerations all the time, but they're used to doing this without labeling them as such. So what was relevant for me in these studies, we started naming them, identifying them as ethically relevant topics. So they became visible, so to say. So yes, so the first answer.
A small question on what you just showed us. Yeah, could you go back? Exactly. So the questions you raised here, does it then mean that you basically followed the STEER ethos in the sense that all these topics were addressed by them and then you reformulated them in the form of a question? Or were there also some questions that basically came up where you made the other person think about additional values? So just because you asked at the beginning about, are you rather on the interventionist side or on the observation side? And I would assume that the second one would be probably more on the interventionist side. And from your paper, I couldn't really figure out on which side you were exactly.
No, and I'm still undecided. And I think Eric and I have been having, a decade worth of discussion on this. I mean, let's be clear. If you look at the background of my PhD was a lot more interventionist, so to say, than maybe a normal STAR study or a normal ethnographic study, because my idea was that research and innovation can enhance if ethical and societal considerations are being integrated and considered more explicitly at early stages of research. That was the hypothesis, so to say. So that's normatively laden, from the start, I would say. But then I also really liked Eric's approach towards, not forcefully, deliberately, trying to impose those, substantive norms on the researchers as you were doing the discussion. That was not the aim, So it's difficult to answer your question. I don't know if it makes any sense what I'm trying to say, but and the other thing I think is also that I did not see myself as a let's say, a neutral observer, I saw myself as somebody potentially having complementary expertise to the expertise that was present in the lab. So yeah, I think an ethnographer would be abhorred, to hear this. But we kind of took that to the extreme and said, well, you're not going to get away from coloring your research material anyway. So let's see, if that makes sense without imposing it. Eric, you want to respond to this?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad we're having this discussion, because I would say that everyone who's basically done STIR in the tradition that has been developed, whether they've done exactly the protocol as I first originated it, or they've developed it, but they've sort of stayed within this ethos of engagement, I would say that all of us are operating between two extremes. And the one extreme is, basically the ethnographic standard, most forms of qualitative participant observation, which really do not try to come in and disturb, except in a few cases of ethnomethodology. And on the other hand, action research, as it's normally understood, where you really are trying to advance a certain goal. So I would say that STIR is designed to be applied in a very flexible way, but in all those ways, it would fit between these two extremes. So this is where we're at. So when we have these discussions, between Marijke and Daan, it's not a question of, are you doing ethnography or action research? It's how do you differentiate your STIR approach between these two poles, between these two extremes? And this is the space that we really need to develop as a research community.
Yes. Nice. Yeah. All right. We can come back to this anyway, right? But looking at the second research, so yes, so the first question, undoubtedly it became visible. Then the second question is, do research participants consider critical reflection on this broader context to be relevant? And here the evidence becomes a lot patchier. If try a few things. First of all, I think what I found surprising was that the perceived relevance of the interaction itself for the researchers at the time was actually quite big. They thought it was extremely helpful to have some, of course, PhD in the lab is a lonesome person. So, they're probably happy with any attention they get, but still, that sort of, structuring and reflection, they really appreciated it. And I'm just picking this quote because it's the nicest one, but, it was shared among the 4 people. So everybody should perhaps reserve free space in their agendas every now and then. Stop all experiments and think. Maybe should one integrate this in each and every PhD project, that someone from outside the faculty comes along and you need to account for your actions towards that person, and the guy sitting in front of you would only have to ask why this, why that, couldn't you do that differently, and how does it work? So apparently, that satisfied a need with the researcher, and and that is, I'm running ahead towards part 3, but that is a consistent finding that I also found in my consultancy later. So that's interesting in itself, I think. And the other finding that is also in the paper is this story that developed around environmental health and safety. So if you look at this laboratory, I won't say where it is or who it is, but the person, nice lab coat, it's all clean and tidy. Then in the other lab, no lab coats, one big mess, stuff everywhere. This is lab 1. And this is lab 2, and importantly, I noticed the people in this lab using 2 gloves to handle acrylamide, which is nasty substance. It's really carcinogenous, nasty stuff. But then they would keep on their gloves, and they would walk to the cupboard or the cabinet and get a flask of something, and they would keep their gloves on. So I didn't want to say you shouldn't be doing that. It's our environmental health and safety concern, but I did relay that I thought it was interesting to if you look at the 2 labs, that there were these differences. But that in itself sparked quite a bit of a stir, pun intended, in the lab. because I then received an email from one of the persons in the group saying, I'll just read it here. It happened many times that when I was handling ethidium bromide gels, some drops reached my clothes or the glove unprotected areas of my hands. Meanwhile, the lab coat was clean and ironed on my chair since some good months. I was thinking that one day I should take the decision to wear mine, even though I'll raise some eyebrows. Then came your presentation, and I remember how I used to take care of my safety and my clothes. Monday, after the seminar, on my way to the lab, I noticed that the research participant wears the lab coat. He was spraying nitrogen on some concentrated samples and needed to protect his clothes. I said to myself, that's the moment. If I come back fast, we'll be wearing the lab coat. I took it and wear it for the rest of the weeks. That's, don't get me wrong, it wasn't my point that the researchers should be wearing lab coats. It's not the improved compliance to environmental health and safety regulations that interested me. What interested me is the fact that simply feeding back such an observation between different practices in the lab led to such a stir. So in a way, the discussion of those broader considerations was relevant in a very direct sense too. Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, the story is even more dramatic because the laboratory went from one in which most people didn't wear a lab coat to a discussion about whether they should or not, and then a silently everyone started wearing lab coats. So it wasn't just this one person or the two people that are referred to. It was a culture change, and it was self-organized, but it wasn't the result of everyone sitting around and deliberating. Right? It was the issue emerged, as you say, the issues are latent and they emerged, and it was uncomfortable to have them emerge, but you weren't there. Nobody was telling them what they have to do. They were just sort of arguing amongst themselves, and then it died down. And then there was this sort of self-correction in the social system.
Yeah. So anyway, take that however you like, but I think these studies did show that there was, or at least for the research participants, there was direct relevance for their own work, so to say. And that's what you might call first order reflective learning. I've taken this from several papers who've written about this. But the idea of first order reflective learning is that it takes place within the boundaries of a value system and background theories. So it's improvement of the technology and the improved achievement of one's own interest in the network. I think there was, evidence of that. But then my interest was also, through the PhD questions, was also in second order reflective learning. And that's that when the background theories and the values of the research system itself become the object of learning. So it's reflection on the research system. And I think it's more difficult to indicate to what extent that sort of reflective learning took place. There were interesting discussions about the societal relevance of research. So one of the questions I would ask each participant is, does society benefit from research? And the general response from everybody, from all the researchers in the lab is, yeah, of course it does. One of the main goals is that society benefits from any research. It's not just a fun thing we're doing here. And another said, yeah, I wouldn't see what would be the point otherwise. If it wouldn't help the rest, if that's the reason, then usually, society should benefit. What would be the point otherwise? But then I would ask them, okay, so does society benefit from your research? And then again, all four of them weren't so sure anymore. So one of them said, well, I hope so. It's not my immediate goal. I haven't thought much about it. What I'm doing is basic research. This is probably a little bit far away from, what I'm doing is too far away. And the other said, well, honestly, I'm not sure I can help. This is more basic science, fundamental science. So that kind of became this, how do you call this, recurring theme, where on the one hand, there is this, conviction that, of course, science is going to help society in all sorts of ways, but nobody can really say, how their research contributes. So, but yeah, I mean, it's, what effect did those discussions have? I'm not sure. I'll leave it. I'll leave it to you. I think for the moment, I would like to leave the presentation of the findings there. I have my own thoughts on it, of course, 15 years later. But maybe we could reserve some time now to see if you have any observations, questions, reflections, suggestions, and also the people who would like to do this. Does this resonate with what you want to do, or you completely lost confidence now, or you think I should have done things differently? Feel free, and anything is fine.
Yeah, Marika.
Yeah, thanks for this interesting presentation. So I actually wanted to follow up on your story about the lab coats, because I also have a lab coat story. It didn't make it in the dissertation, but I still found it interesting because what I observed in a laboratory was that people were putting on lab coats as soon as journalists arrived. And were also often asked by journalists, or especially if there was filmmaking going on, can you please put on a lab coat? Because it was the signaling of expertise, authority, especially because they were working with participants. And in that case, the researchers were actually saying we're not really comfortable with wearing lab coats because they signal something that we don't really want to signal. We don't want to be in a superior position in comparison to our research participants. So there was a really good reason why they were not wearing lab coats. And I also have to say that in their case, they weren't working with dangerous materials. It was more about protecting your clothes from something. But that made me think maybe there were good reasons why the researchers in your case weren't wearing lab coats, especially now that Eric mentioned there was a big discussion on whether to do so or not. So I don't know, were there some reasons why people would not wear lab coats? And why was in the end your intervention the one basically convincing them to do so? So maybe you have some more ethnographic insights on that.
Yeah, well, insights I'm not sure, but I did find that there was simply a lot of peer pressure. I think they they were working with carcinogen substances, so I think and also they were working with microorganisms, so I think it was very valid to wear the lab coats in principle. But you get this group think where you don't want to be what is it what is a nice word to say you don't want to be somebody who's I don't know the English expression, but somebody who's always kind of more neat and more tidy than anybody else. Eric, do you have a word for this?
Felix Unger of the Odd Couple. There's the neat guy and the sloppy guy.
Yeah. So there was a lot of that, and then I think that's also in the quote that I showed. That's exactly what happened. So nobody does it. Well, you feel the odd one out if you're wearing that lab coat. And then when I showed, well, actually, in the other lab, this is very normal, and everybody does that. That was a reason for her. She felt empowered to kind of make that point again. But that, of course, also is breaking the rules of the lab where you're working, and you're kind of making yourself vulnerable there. So that's also why I think the discussion got so difficult, because somebody's saying, what we're doing isn't right here. And the other lab I know quite well because I spent a long time there. And there is a lady from the environmental health and safety, control, whatever, management, and she's just on top of everything. So nobody dares to take off their lab coat because they're expelled immediately. So I think it's very much a cultural thing, and it's latent in the group and empowered by each of the individuals. So it either becomes a vicious cycle or a virtuous cycle, I think. I'm just going to put on the light here because it's getting dark in the Netherlands. Eric, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I wanted to point out that it's important for us to recognize that there are two levels of this discussion. One level is what's the right thing to do? Should you wear a lab coat or not? Right? But for me, there's a much more interesting question that gets to governance, and it gets to the capacity of scientists as individuals, as small groups, as communities who are quasi-autonomous to participate in governance more robustly, even if we don't change these big techno-economic structures and paradigms. And that is the ability of small groups and large groups to self-organize in a way that changes culture. So we're talking about culture change, and we're talking about organizational change. And this is more interesting because it's cultural and organizational change around a normative topic. So instead of saying that these sort of deficiencies, these moral deficiencies in scientific and technological production that are, to some extent leading to social inequities and environmental destruction, that these need to be changed simply from the top down by government laws. It's also saying, well, there's another resource, guys, and that is the ability of human beings as individuals to interact and shift incrementally. Now, this is not going to solve every problem that we have, but without it, I think we're lost. And in the absence of strong, hard laws, which we may never get, it's at least something we can do now. And what is interesting about Daan's case here is that just by asking questions, he triggered this process. So my political science mind thinks, well, is it possible if we have more of this kind of critical reflection, which is triggered only by asking questions, listening, asking questions, listening, and these questions are probing questions, right? They're questions, well, what do you think about that, right? It would be interesting to dig into one of Daan's examples. How did he ask these questions without going over, into the line of advocacy or judgment or critique, right? But asking critically reflective questions, because this is a powerful tool to trigger cultural and organizational change. I'll stop.
Oh, that's good, Eric. In the meantime, though, I see, and also, I mean, for everybody, this is the end of part one, so to say. So we're about to move to part two. That's the current state of STIR. And I missed actually quite a number of comments in the chat. But there has been some discussion there. Would you like to comment on it? I see Lyric has made a comment, and Juan Carlos and Maximilian. I think I'm just going to try to give the floor to each of you in turn. So Lyric, you have a topic for later. Maybe that's now. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, that sounds good. So my comment was about in-person versus virtual studies. And I kind of started learning about STIR a few years ago after the pandemic had already started. So every study I've ever done has been virtual. And particularly with the group I'm working with, we're all in IT and we're all working from home. So people are very hesitant to turn on their cameras. And that is a concern for me, because you're not connecting as well as you would if you were in person. And so as the facilitator of the session, I am trying to build comfort with this person. So I'm like riding this line between asking them to turn on their camera, and I will lead by example and just turn mine on, and they don't have to turn theirs on if they don't want to. But that is kind of like a cultural thing that I'm challenged by in my own study. And I also wanted to say, Daan, I thought it was very interesting that you asked your participants first if they thought research should improve society or contribute to society. I don't remember exactly how you phrased it. And then asking them if their own work was contributing to society. That's like a very, to me, that feels like an intense question. because it's turning the spotlight back on you. And I was just putting in the chat, you know, if I felt like my work wasn't contributing to society, I would definitely feel self-conscious, and it does kind of trigger that like self-reflection, reflexivity in a big way.
Yeah. So coming back to that last point first, yes, it was and I think I was only able to posit that question at later stages of research, when you really kind of, you know, they felt comfortable and at ease, and we had an understanding and rapport, and they knew that, you know, I wasn't putting them on the spot. And I think, you know, by simply posing those questions, they did, you know, seriously start to think about, you know, what kind of, where does this mismatch come from, and what does it mean? You know, if none of us can explain what the benefit is of what we're doing, then how can we all be so sure that the whole thing benefits society? So and the first question, I think you're always going to have, you know, it's always going to be a little bit more difficult if you're just doing this behind a computer. I think that the pandemic has taught us how to make virtual conferences work. So I think it's already a lot better than it was 2 years ago. But you're absolutely right. You know, just the little sensitivities and just sensing that, you know, the conversation needs something, you're gonna miss that. So I think actually it would be really interesting to compare those different outcomes. And I wouldn't even, you're kind of, you know, you're saying, you know, are there any measurable differences? I would almost say yes, of course there are. So what are the measurable differences, and how do we monitor them? I think that might also be something for Eric and Marijke to ponder, especially if, you know, even after the pandemic, I think virtual conferencing will continue, at least for, you know, intercontinental meetings. So it might be interesting in a more general sense to see what exactly, you know, can we put a finger on what exactly it is that we're missing if we're meeting virtually. So that's really interesting. But it's going to be a little bit more difficult, I think.
Yeah, and if I can just piggyback on this topic, and I know that Carlos might want to also jump in, but there's sort of two basic approaches to this. One is we just conduct a bunch of in person, we conduct a bunch of virtual, and after the fact, we come back and we analyze them. The other approach is much more rigorous and demanding, and that is before you start to conduct these studies, you think about indicators that you're going to pay attention to, and you build these into the study. Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah, so those of you interested in actually studying these differences, it's a question of whether you're going to do a retrospective analysis when you have multiple cases to analyze, or if you're going to do your own sort of microanalysis where you might do your own comparison, or at least set up the first part of a secondary comparison.
Yeah. But just on the bright side, and I'll get to you, Antonia, in a second, but just to finish this point, I was involved in a very intense discussion about the transport of dangerous goods through rail, through city centers. And there was at the beginning of the pandemic, and we thought, you know, we're never going to pull this off because the stakeholders were just, they were, you know, and it's somehow we also made that work. So it's not that, you know, if you have a virtual meeting, it's impossible to, you know, sense the sensitivities, as it were, but it's a little bit more difficult. Yeah. Antonia?
So I have also a comment regarding the question, because I liked it also very much. And my comment is a bit out of the STIR scope, but I have also discovered in my work with researchers that it's so important to make things personal. Otherwise, they don't make the connection. Otherwise, they think that it's something that's far away from them. So I have a whole tool of questions and warm-up exercises to put spotlight on them. And then they somehow wake up. But yeah, this is a really good trick, and it works, and it makes them feel somehow different. No, not really professional, because when you make it personal, so they start assuming more responsibility. So I have sometimes I ask in the beginning, in the, let's say, virtual coffee break or real coffee break, what do you care about in this world? And then they start, oh, I like skiing, so I like mountains and oceans because I live in front of the ocean and all these things. And you say, oh, so in this way you get to know the people, because they tell you about their hobbies, about what they do in their free time, and you see that they're really passionate about these things. And then the next tricky question is, what do you do as a researcher to show how you care about these things? And then I feel blocked, because I say, okay, I said that I really care about this and this, but actually I don't do anything as a researcher to contribute. And you see a big gap, and it happens not only to the researchers that we work with, but also with ourselves. So it's nice to construct this bridge. What do you care about, and how do you show your care to the things now that you feel connected to?
Yeah, absolutely. I saw that there were still some comments from Juan Carlos and from Maximilian. Juan Carlos, do you want to expand on your comment? You're muted, Juan Carlos. I'm not sure. There's Antonia and Eric raising their hands. Just 1 second. I'm just Juan Carlos, let us know when you find the unmute button. In the meantime, I would just like to ask Maximilian. I don't think we've met Maximilian. So welcome to this meeting. You also had a comment. You want to kind of explain?
Yeah, I have to apologize. COVID hit me today, it seems, so it wouldn't be much of an aesthetic experience as now seeing my face in this miserable situation. So apologies for that. But I was just in, so we're doing similar stuff, I think. So I'm not following the STIR protocol, but we are sort of embedded ethicists and social scientists at the Technical University of Munich. And we're also trying to find ways of inducing reflexivity in research practices. And we also see, and was sort of a comment on one of the last slides that you've shown, that there's sort of this, it seems to us that the more a field or a discipline itself sort of emphasizes the wider societal impact and relevance, the more we see sort of in our interviews often that the PhD researchers who are in this very vulnerable position in these institutions often try to push back these narratives of big relevance, of huge impact. And that is sort of something that I've also seen in your research. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit on maybe the relationships between senior and early career researchers, because that is also something that is very interesting to us.
Yes, absolutely. In my studies, they were all PhDs. This was deliberate for a number of reasons. First of all, because they take the time to sit with you for 12 weeks, day in, day out. So they're the most available, as it were. And we also wanted to have, again, the little graph, the little Excel table. We want to have the same kind of level to see if, to make comparisons easier. If you talk to the lab leaders, though, you get a completely different picture, a much more let's say long-term, long-scale picture, and the sense of what the group has to bring to society is also a lot more nuanced, and it's also that plays out on a much longer time frame. So they will say, I can't tell you, silicocystis is used for making green diesel. I can't tell you when it will happen, but there's this huge societal challenge. We're facing energy shortages. It will happen, and we just need 20 years before we can engineer these cyanobacteria to the state where we have completely effective biodiesel production systems. You know, just wait and see. And usually the PhD isn't quite at that level. You know, they're trying to get their papers out and trying to get to terms with the techniques, and they're much more at the level of understanding the science that they're actually doing. It's also, I think that's one of the things through working with researchers that I've learned over the years. I've become so much more appreciative over the complexity of what they're doing. I mean, I always knew that science was difficult, but just getting a sense of how they survive in this ultra competitive world where, you know, the science just evolves, especially biotech and nanotech, the science evolves so rapidly. You know, how do they even, you know, keep up, you know, be good enough to get their next postdoc and the next postdoc and the next postdoc. So I am, yeah, a lot less kind of critically inclined, because I just see the complexity of the world that they need to survive in. I don't know if that answers your question, Maximilian, but I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about it, you know, at some stage, because it looks like what you're doing in Munich is very comparable to what we were trying to do in Delft. So that'd be good. Let's stay in touch. Nice to meet you. For the moment, there's also Eric who has raised his hand.
I just wanted to sort of comment on the last 3 or 4 exchanges, just to sort of emphasize a couple things. One is that there's a very nice liminal space between, sort of taking the position that I care or my research contributes, or on the other hand, my research really doesn't do anything and I don't care. Or the second person, you should care or you do care, right? So these strong normative positions, right? What we're all talking about and what Antonia was talking about, bringing people into this liminal space where you go, well, I say that I care, and on some level I do care, but now I clearly have to face the fact that in my behavior and my choices, it's not showing up. And this is an uncomfortable place to be in. And what I really appreciated about Antonia is that she said, and also for ourselves, as the people asking these questions, as the researchers, I think STIR really only works as a dialogue if we are willing to step into these uncomfortable normative liminal spaces that we're pulling or inviting our participants into, right? And this is the place of cognitive dissonance. This is the place of disconcertment, where something feels off and we're not perfectly lined up. And it's a place that people don't like to live in. Structures, cultural structures, social discourses, they don't like to be here because you don't have this clear moral position of, oh, this doesn't matter, or, oh, yes, I'm doing everything. But it's this potent area of where organizational and cultural change and personal change can develop out of. And so I really want to say that, it's a resource both for academic insights into sort of areas that might not otherwise be seen, which is basically the potential, the capacity for change, not just what people say about why they don't change. But it's also, then it relates to Maximilian's question, because you can see how the differences emerge across cultures, across age groups, across social positions, positionality. And I'm just thinking of cases in which PhD students and postdocs would say things like, well, this really isn't my responsibility. It's the lab directors or it's my supervisors. And then you talk to the supervisor and they will say almost flippantly sometimes, either they give you a line, yes, it's all taken care of, or they sort of open up and they say, well, I just have to lie in my research proposals, otherwise I won't get funded. The system is corrupt, right? Mm-hmm. And then of course we're, from a standpoint of governance, we think, well, couldn't it be better? And what can we do that's different? Well, there's different responses at that level. One is we can write a report, we can make policy recommendations, we can try to intervene into the situation and become action researchers and say, why don't you change right now, right? But another potential approach and response is to just keep doing STIR. Stay calm and keep stirring, because this reminds everyone that there are these liminal spaces, these liminal normative spaces where we feel a dissatisfaction with our relationship to our work. And this is collectively felt, but it's not usually given voice. And so this is, again, the power of stir, and this gets into Alexander Haustein's ideas of resonance, because we can then resonate with these latent, unexpressed, invisible feelings, affects, emotions, but also intuitions and cognitions, and sort of build them and allow them to grow in strength, because then they will urge their human embodied subjects to then maybe, have a second order reflexive moment, which might lead to action based on that.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the time, and it's almost 6:45. I think we need to wrap up at 7, right? So, and I've noted Juan Carlos's question. I see that you're having difficulty with the internet, Juan Carlos. That's no problem. But you said you would like to know a little about the ethical values that arose after the interaction and the application of stir in the laboratories you studied. So I'm going to open my presentation again. This is not it. I'm going to share that again. I just unshared it, but it was doing strange things. Let's see if it's better now. Yeah, just to kind of wrap this up, I also been thinking about, hang on. Where are we? Share screen, screen 2. I also been thinking about, what do I think of, what do I make of this all of this 15 years on, and the response. I think this holds a response to Juan Carlos. The first thing, though, is that that this exercise was a deeply enriching experience to me personally. I think this deeper understanding of how science is done in the lab has really helped me to do what I do now as a consultant much more effectively. So I think that's one point of reflection that I have. The second is that what I really like about stir, as I was saying, back in 2006, 2007, there wasn't a lot to go on, and I think stir has been something of a movement. And this is just a picture, Eric, I dug up from my from my albums, and this is us in Vatnahalsen. This is also I think 8 or 9.
This is actually Bergen, right before we went to Vatnahalsen.
Yeah. Exactly, and you see the stir group, and I think I don't have any more recent picture, but I think that vibe, that dynamic has been moving forward. So thanks to Eric for your relentless effort to make this thing happen. But that it feels good to be part of such a movement. And even though I'm doing completely different things, I somehow glad to still be a part of that movement. On a somewhat more, let's say, sober note, and in response to Juan Carlos's comment, I think I have been caught up a little bit with the resilience of the research system, in the sense that, if you look back on what actually happened, or what difference does it all make, these 15 years of banging your head against the wall of research, maybe not so much. With Wim Vermaas also, we had let's say a brief moment of reflection, interviewing the research participants 2 years after. I think it was in 2010 or 2011, and you also found there that the kind of the experiences on that side were rather short-lived. And that's I think a consistent finding that I have been finding. Researchers are genuinely interested in engaging with different sorts of expertise that maybe has something to do with how they're wired, but it still seems to be very hard to make that have any effect on what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And I'm not sure what the others think of this, but yeah, that's how I experienced it. I'm just trying to get rid of it's a bit weird. I have these two screens, and PowerPoint seems to mess up my control of that because it's in presentation mode. I'm just gonna get out of here. Try to get back to the next part of the presentation. You're now seeing the picture, right? I'm just going to stop sharing for the moment. Maybe try to reshare. It just opens up a whole bunch of screens, and I just lose control of which one I'm handling. But Eric, make your comment as I try to get the presentation back in order.
Yeah, just a comment on the sort of that third point, the sobering point, and I think the resilience of the socio-technical, cultural, institutional systems that produce science and innovation in the world and continue to transform the world. On some level, it's disappointing to reflect on that, but at the same time, we have to remind ourselves that this was the situation that we began with. This is why STIR was developed, and this is why we started using STIR, because we saw how resilient these systems are, and we thought, well, is there anything from within? Are there any seeds of change from within that we can understand? And then understanding these, right? And I think we've been building up some understanding of some of those seeds. And so now the question is what to do with them. One option, which I just voiced earlier, is to keep on stirring and to hope that it reaches critical mass. Another is to input this information into organizational design, institutional design, project design, program design, policy design, okay? But I just wanted to sort of point that out. And then another sort of comment is, in terms of this long-term capacity building, I think it's a good research question that we have to take up as a community, and that is maybe one 12-week study isn't enough to build long-term capacity. But then again, we don't need somebody in the laboratory stirring every day of the week, every month of the year, right? So what is the sweet spot? And one idea that I've been toying with for a while is, well, maybe if you just get a visit once a year and the visit's only 3 weeks long, right? So we can sort of imagine these future worlds in which STIR or something like STIR, some version of critical reflection that's part of practices gets embedded, and it's not too painful to include it. It's not too expensive to include it, but it gives just enough to enhance the agency of scientific actors.
Yeah. That sounds like a good segue in the last bit of this presentation. I realize it may be a little bit much because we've covered a lot of ground, but just to kind of give you some idea of how I think, for me, what I try to do in the consultancy, in the Proeffabriek, is a very logical extension of all those questions that were raised as part of the STIR study and the PhD. So I just love to share with you a little bit, and hope also to hear from you whether you kind of see any connections with what's going on in STIR at the moment. So just bear with me for a couple of minutes as I try to explain what this is about. One step back. So why I started the Proeffabriek is because I was convinced that I'm a believer in research and innovation, so to say. I do believe that it can help to address some of the challenges that we're facing today, but in my the way I see it is that the way research and innovation are working is we're just not getting the results that we can or we should from research and innovation. So my mantra has been ever since that social value creation needs to be put at the heart of research and innovation governance. So realizing social and environmental benefits in addition to economic gain. And here I think is also where you'll recognize the upstream, midstream, downstream picture. And Eric and I have been discussing this quite a bit. I still think, that the midstream is an important arena to open up research decision making to a broader range of voices. But I'm also getting the sense that we have to simultaneously, as it were, work on the upstream on making societal challenges a research priority, and on the downstream to make sure that social and environmental indicators are included in the appraisal of technologies. So that's what I've been kind of working on for the last 10 years or so. It's been an incredible ride. And I think part of that is because you do see that the tide is turning in a way. If you look at the Green Deal in Europe, you can say, well, bureaucratic exercise, but just imagine whether that would have been possible, say 20 years ago. I mean, in a way, there is, beneath the surface, there is just such a shift and such a rising awareness, at least in policy, of the need to change. So I think the impact of what's going on there shouldn't be underestimated. And coincidentally, for me, that's been a great wave to ride on, as it were. But I would argue that at this point, that wave is becoming so big that there are many more people like you and me, like the people in the room now, who both understand the innovation system from inside out, but also have a sense of the societal dimension of all that, and who know how to work across disciplines that are urgently needed to help shape that transition. So I'm actually, inviting you to become, part in that transition, and that plays out partly in the lab, but also partly beyond it. And I would just like to give this example of safe and sustainable by design that is now being adopted as a formal concept as part of the European chemical strategy. So I've been working with Bart Walhout, some of you may know Bart, at RIVM, and also with the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management to develop this concept of safe by design, now safe and sustainable by design. And in a nutshell, it means that safety and sustainability considerations are incorporated in research decision making from the very first stages of research. Sound familiar, right? But so what it means is that researchers need to start thinking about the chemical traits that the products they help create, and the ways that these products might be used when they enter the marketplace, and what may happen at the end of their life cycle needs to be thought out by researchers from the get-go. And that means that somehow we have to close the cycle of this linear innovation model and try to feed back the insights from society and environment back into the design stage. That's the big challenge, and I think that challenge may look familiar to some of your people. And the picture that I have here is taken from a series of interviews that I did with people at the RIVM, the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and the Environment in the Netherlands. And I said, I asked them, what sort of expertise do you think we need to realize safe and sustainable by design? This is what they came up with. So, disparate fields of research, circular economy, safety policy, design, societal responsibility, and within that, very disparate partial fields, so to say, that all need to come together if we want to make safe and sustainable by design a reality. So, lots of questions to be asked here still, but what is clear is that researchers and product developers and designers and toxicologists and sustainability experts and social scientists all need to start working together to start incorporating safety and sustainability considerations in research and innovation. And this, of course, requires the help of people, like you and me. it needs that sort of experience. And I really think, there's all things you can say about safe and sustainable by design. And the way that it's now becoming a big policy concept, you immediately see that, people are trying to empty it out, like has happened to RRI once it became a cross-cutting issue in Europe. I mean, in a way, it's good when concepts become part of the policy debate, because they get a lot of more traction, but they also become a lot more inflexible, and it's a lot more interest driven. But whereas I think what RRI had difficulty with, namely to engage the enactor community, as it were, it was still very much a social science driven thing. I think safe and sustainable by design is destined, or has the opportunity to go in another way, because it offers very tangible, better research outcomes, namely products that are less damaging to human health and less damaging to the environment. And it also offers a credible way how to get there, namely through this iterative, interactive design approach that has been shown to deliver results in some cases. I'm not sure how familiar you are with green chemistry or with cradle-to-cradle or circular design or inherently safer design, but there are kind of approaches that actually do show that things can improve in a quantifiable and measurable way. But as I said, we need new forms of interaction between the various disciplines involved. And I also did another short-term research project for the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management to kind of explore how you could incorporate what the ministry called a reflexive component in technical research aimed at safe by design. So this was a great opportunity for me to map all those various experiences, with STIR, which is kind of in model 2, the researcher and the embedded humanist, but also other models to kind of see how you could build in this reflexive component. Anyway, there's a lot to say about this. I'm looking at the time. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I'd like to get some final comments from you back. But, with this short expose, I hope, that I've convinced you somehow that the Proeffabriek is a natural extension of the interdisciplinary engagement that you're also working with in STIR, and also to inspire you to contribute to, work towards that socially responsive research and innovation system, in the lab, but also beyond it. Just one final note, I was also able to help the ministry with an NWO call, which is a Dutch science, it's like the Dutch NSF. And this call came out. It is now, the proposals are now being evaluated, but it was quite radical. We said you could only join this proposal if you show how producers, users, social scientists, and sustainability experts are involved at the structural level of research design. So I'm very curious to see what will come out, if there's going to be any viable proposal. But at least I think that these are alternative ways to see how we can expedite that transition towards a more socially responsive research and innovation system. I'll stop there, but maybe I'll also stop sharing so I can see your faces again. Any final comments on this, maybe? Oh.
And Marika.
Yeah, first of all, many thanks for the presentation and also the last part. This is really impressive. Yeah, I think I just have to at one point talk to you in person how you managed that transition from research into consultancy, because yeah, it seems you managed to get a lot out of STIR for your work now, and that it's really having a lot of fruitful results. So again, I'm really impressed. And I think I have one last question, which is whether the move from research to consultancy also came about because you saw a tension between doing STIR and between doing research. And just a concrete example, I had a research participant who was actually at the end of my STEER study also commenting on the relevance of STEER for his or her work and saying this is high, but that it would have been better if I had not tried to exploit our conversations for research purposes, because of course I was recording it. He knew that he would be anonymous, but still there's some hesitancy of opening up, and that he would actually have preferred to have this really just between us and as a consultancy, in the form of consultancy or personal training, coaching, however you want to call it. There's so many different words for it. So was that also a reason that you made that move, or did you actually feel the two were pretty compatible? So yeah, that's my last question.
Yeah, that's a difficult one in closing, because I've got a million responses, both on a personal level. You know, are you a researcher or, let's say, an advisor or consultant? I think I'm firmly in the second part. Also, I felt doing the PhD, you know, I love the rigor of doing science, but I don't like the fact that, you know, our careers are determined by the papers we write about research that we did a year ago. You know, once I finish the research, I want to do the next, you know, once I did the study, I want to do the next study. And I don't care, you know, if my peers, you know, scrutinize what sort of effect it had. You know, everybody sees that it had an effect. So I just want to make that effect, you know, possible as much as I can, stir as much as I can without having to justify it all the time. But also, I think on a more, let's say, on a level of social responsibility, I really feel that, you know, our expertise is needed, and it's an unmet, you know, need still. You know, the academic world, you know, and the consultancy world, there is so much knowledge, let's put it that way, in the academic world that I would say needs to be put out there and needs to work in The Hague and in Brussels and in Washington, you know, and it's just not happening. So I was invited by the European Commission in an advisory group to come up, you know, okay, so, you know, sounds good what you have to say. Show me, you know, who can do this. And I really had difficulties coming up with people who would just set aside everything to work on those policy questions, because, yeah, you know, it's interesting, but I'll only do it if I can write a paper on it, or, you know, if I could put a PhD on it, and it's going to take 4 years. Well, you know, sorry, but then the commission is gone. So I think, yeah, I'm ranting a little bit because I have so many kind of beliefs around. Maybe we should just continue that conversation later over a beer or a coffee, Marijk, sometime.
And I'll just say, let's continue the conversation as a group, because I think a lot of people have ideas that can contribute to that. And, you know, the first thing that occurs to me is that we can lobby and raise funding, whether it's public or private, for fellowships that allow faculty, postdocs, and PhD researchers to actually slip into that mode. Of course, people are trying this all over the place. ASU has a number of initiatives, but really nothing has really taken hold to the extent that it steps up to the vision and the urge and the need. So let's keep the conversation alive. Thank you so much, Daan. Thanks, Marijke, for that question. Thanks, Daan, for an amazing seminar, and everyone for their participation. Really, really appreciate it, and looking forward to next month.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting